Timelash is generally regarded as one of the worst Doctor Who stories of all time, along with the Twin Dilemma. It's not quite as bad as all that. There are a few strong guest performances and some decent ideas, but the terrible script and shoddy production means it's easily the low point of the season. It's set on the planet Carfel, another one of those Doctor Who worlds ruled over by an oppressive dictator. This one's called the Borad. He has a Stargate-like device called a Timelash, and anyone who rebels against his reign is sent through it to live forever on Earth in the distant past, which sounds like by far the superior option. The TARDIS doesn't land on Carfel until halfway through part 1. Until then, there's a lot of messing about with star maps and seatbelts, which is really just obvious padding. When they do get there, it turns out the Doctor has already visited the place, back when he was John Pertwee. Somehow no books or audios have ever told that story, though I'm sure Big Finish will get round to it eventually. Peri is captured and put on a leash. Nowadays you have to pay extra for that kind of content. She is threatened by the Morlocks, which has to be one of the least impressive monsters the show has ever had. It's very obviously just a puppet, and not a very good one. The Banderill is just as bad, but at least that one only appears on the screen. The Doctor takes the TARDIS back to Scotland in 1885, where the rebel Vina has ended up after being pushed through the Timelash. Here she meets a man called Herbert, who is English. If only he'd been Scottish, the story would have been eerily similar to Outlander. As it is, their potential romance never really goes anywhere, much like all of the other plot points. Herbert turns out to be H.G. Wells, which is the only thing I remember from my first viewing of this 40 years ago. I don't know if this portrayal fits the author's real character, but it does seem rather arrogant to say that one of the greatest science fiction writers of all time was inspired by this story. I guess it could have inspired him to write tales that make more sense. The cliffhanger involves the Doctor being sentenced to go through the Timelash, even though it's already been established that he would just end up stranded back on Earth. Instead, he starts a revolution, but he ends up climbing into the Timelash anyway, in order to steal some crystals. I'm not sure how all this works. If you go through fast enough, you end up going through a portal to Earth, but if you just step inside, you end up climbing down a wall, like some low-budget version of the Crystal Maze. The villains are well cast at least. Paul Darrow from Blake 7 plays Tekka, who's appointed to rule over the Carfelians by the Borad. Like on his other show, he relishes the chance to go over the top, but where Raven was more of an anti-hero, Tekka is just a straight-up villain, so there's nothing to stop him from going full-on pantomime bad guy, and it's glorious to watch. In particular, his scenes with Colin Baker are hugely entertaining, each one of them trying to upstage the other. The Borad's appearance is kept hidden for most of his scenes, which builds up the tension nicely, and when he is finally revealed, it is a decent make-up job. He's like a bizarre human-walrus hybrid, and it still looks good even under the harsh studio lights. Robert Ashby underplays his role to contrast with Paul Darrow, and is chillingly effective. Sadly, both Tekka and the Borad are dead with 15 minutes left to go of the story, which feels like the writer got the pacing very wrong. There are a lot of superfluous TARDIS scenes to pad out the runtime, where the Doctor somehow manages to stop the Banderill attack without ever explaining how. And then another Borad appears from out of nowhere. It turns out he had a clone, which was never even hinted at before. But it all works out as he ends up going through the Timelash, where the Doctor suggests he will end up becoming the Loch Ness Monster, even though they already explained that in Terror of the Zygons, and the Borad isn't nearly big enough to be mistaken for a sea serpent. The whole production looks incredibly cheap, lots of big empty sets lacking in detail, and no sense of any kind of real society on Carfel. It's just totally unconvincing all round. About the only saving grace is the actors. Even the small parts are well cast. Stephen McIntosh and Christine Kavanagh play rebels in the opening scenes, and both went on to much bigger things. And Tracy Louise Ward, who played Katz, has possibly the best IMDb biography I've ever read. The niece of the Earl of Dudley, she was expelled from 2 schools, once for slapping a teacher who told her off for giggling in church. After taking her A-levels, she was sent to Paris to study French, but walked out after 2 months in order to work as a model. She was a rebellious child, at first shut away and brought up by a nanny, and then sent to a boarding school where she was bored. At the age of 17, she studied art in Italy for a year, then went to America, where she sold yogurt cones in New York. Returning to London, she earned her equity card by doing a one-woman show around pubs and clubs in London, peeling down to a camisole and suspender belt while listening a monologue with 4-letter words. She is married to Henry John Fitzroy Somerset, the son of the 11th Duke of Beaufort. Why isn't there a biopic about her life? It sounds amazing. The DVD has just the one 25-minute behind-the-scenes documentary. There is more on the Blu-ray, which I'll talk about after I've seen the whole season. It's very fair. Everyone praises the director and the borrowed makeup, while complaining about the quality of the script, which was by a very inexperienced writer. Glenn McCoy had only written 2 episodes of Angels before this, and he went on to write for El Dorado, which is widely regarded as one of the worst soap operas ever made. They just started repeating that recently, and it turns out it's not quite that bad, but still it's no wonder Glenn McCoy became a business coach instead. Overall, a very poor instalment. The guest cast are certainly watchable, but it all looks extremely cheap, and the story is hopelessly generic. 2 out of 10. Next week, Revelation of the Daleks, which should hopefully be a lot better. We're very near the end of the season now, which should be a relief, except there's that whole never-ending trial coming up in the next season, so it won't be long before I have to sit through that again. So press subscribe if you want to see my thoughts on Revelation of the Daleks and all the stories that come afterwards, and I'll see you next time.